wrong.
Probably right.
Linguistic.
Okay, page Yud Zion. So what we were talking about was that the Rebbe was saying, for whatever reason, and he said we don't want to get into the reasons, but that the psychology of children today is very different than what it once was, and adults as well, which is that everybody thinks that they're ready, they know everything already. No, but then nobody's interested in hearing from anybody else. Everybody knows, they know. And what happens is before their way of thinking and their hashkafas are properly developed, they already have their own mahalach. And therefore, when the father or the teacher or anybody comes to try to impose on them, they automatically reject it and they automatically fight against it because they feel like they have a derech, and now the father's coming to impose his derech on them. He's like a foreign ruler. So the Rebbe says like this: Im nachdor, it's the first full paragraph on Yud Zayin. Im nachdor el toich nefesh hanar. If we were to penetrate into the essence of the soul of the child, v'nizboinin b'nisyonis zakim, and we would attempt delicately, v'amitiim and really b'chol malach in all ways, we would try to really get to the core of the issue. Nero, we would see she'al pi haroiv ein hanar sar midach Hashem b'pam echas. A kid doesn't go from one Shabbos davening with kavana and keeping Shabbos and singing Zmiras to the next Shabbos smoking a cigarette and going to the movies, right? That's not a transition that happens like that. It doesn't happen in one instant. Maybe there are times where it does, but in general, that's not how it happens. He also doesn't go from the base medrash to the theaters in one instant. It doesn't develop. The kid doesn't go from being a solid, upstanding citizen to going off the derech instantly. Hagemara Meres, the Gemara tells us that kachu menasa sheyetzahara. This is how the Yetzirah works. He starts off slowly. He knows that if he goes to a kid who's doing very well in yeshiva and tells him go eat chazer, it's never going to happen. So he starts with sleep a little bit late. You can come a few minutes late to davening, and he slowly builds on this until he can finally get him where he wants. Bashkof Rishona miskabel haroisha migamara zoish enenu maschil miyad ba'averes hachamuros. The Gemara is telling us that he doesn't start. The Yetzirah does not begin with big averes. Ela b'hadroga hoylech mehakel akaved. He starts with the lighter averes, smaller infractions, ones that are almost imperceptible, until he gets more severe and more severe. But in reality, before you even get to that first small infraction, before the kid even comes to davening late, in his inner, in the area in his brain that is the crisis center, where things start to go wrong, even that doesn't start with these small infractions. Rak lifnei shana yoser, but a year or more before that, his chila daite lehispatzeamat. He starts to get his mind starts to become warped a little bit. Petza ve'ena petza. It's imperceptible. You can't pick up on it. It's a minor injury to the mind. Kenega nearly bias, like the pasuk says by the Mitzayra, that when he calls the kohen, it says kenega nearly bias. It might be an affliction. It might not. I'm not sure if there's something wrong. This kid, there's nothing that you can notice on the outside. Again, I keep saying kid, but we understand we're talking about anybody. It doesn't happen. So you'll hear, let's say, for example, let's say learning. We've been learning Hilchas Basa B'Cholov. So you hear people say, the Chachamim, maybe they went a little overboard, right? Like, is that really the intention? Like, what we forget is who we're questioning. We're questioning poskim that were light years ahead of us. Or a person will say, like, muktzah. It was just a gedder. I could touch money. I know I'm not going to go to the store on Shabbos, right? He starts to question Chazal. He starts to question people that were much greater than him. He doesn't do anything differently. He still keeps the halachas of muktzah. He still keeps the halachas of basa v'chol. He doesn't start. But that beginning, that type of thought process where he feels that he's able to question what's going on. He's not necessarily bound by everything that came before him. So with that, he opens the door to allow a little bit more and a little bit more until slowly he starts doing some minor averas, and then and it grows to bigger averas. Right? And that the Yetzirah can easily get into anybody's head because you won't feel guilty about it. I'm asking a question. It's part of learning. I want to ask a question. But we know when we're being honest with ourselves which of those questions are really to learn more and which of those questions are really we're looking for an easy way out or we're looking for a way to knock it. So, rak kinega. It's like a nega, right? The pasuk talks about it's like a nega. Nega ve'ena nega. It's sort of a wound, but it's not really a wound. We're not sure if it's a wound. And then from this slight crumb thought, it expands. Eventually, he starts to look at Torah and serving Hashem as something lowly, something unimportant, something that's a waste of time. And the outside world of silliness and crass things and wanton pleasures, as if they're good, as if they're beautiful and good. Even a small reason can start to create this. Because it starts to bother him and he doesn't work on it. Nobody notices any change in the kid. He has a few questions, he keeps it to himself. He's still embarrassed maybe about these questions. It slowly deepens inside of him, and it expands in his thought process, till it starts to destroy him. Suddenly there's a loud noise. He leaves the house of Hashem and he falls into Rahman al-Islan. So you say another example we see this is, let's say here, remember when we were kids and they used to tell us a medrash, right? We took it, it was amazing, it impressed us, it was amazing, wonderful medrash. And when we get a little older, we start to say, did it really happen? You have all kinds of academic pieces. It's just a lesson. We're not impressed by it once. They say the story about the Rebbe Reb Zusha. The Rebbe Reb Zusha, when he would have a problem every time he sat down to learn Chumash. Because he would sit down to learn Chumash, and he would say, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Leimer. And he would start jumping up and down. He says, you hear this? HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to a human being. Like he couldn't get past, he was so overwhelmed by it. Many kids today, many adults today, did Hashem really speak to Moshe? What does it mean he spoke to Moshe? How did he speak to Moshe? Right? We have too many questions. We don't have that unbridled enthusiasm and that acceptance of Chazal, and that's where it starts. And then the kid starts to think that way, or the adult starts to think that way, and all of a sudden, it grows, and he throws off the yoke, and people don't know where it came from. His parents and his teachers, I understand. Yesterday he was keeping Shabbos, today he's not keeping Shabbos. It's true that last Shabbos he kept Shabbos, and this Shabbos he's Mechal Shabbos, but last Shabbos he was barely keeping Shabbos. You didn't realize that he wasn't really keeping Shabbos. But this is a process that happened over months, years. It's just, now we when we see it, it's already very far gone. Al Pi Roiv, the next paragraph, bottom, last two lines of Yud Zayin. Al Pi Roiv nega pnimi ze banefesh. Generally, this is an internal in the inside the nefesh. Where does it come from? It min yeshus v'isnagdus and eskarm leil. This comes from that sense of self and that adversarial attitude that the current generations have, that we described earlier. This idea that at 5 years old they know everything. They can't learn from anybody. You see this, but this is not, and the Rebbe is going to say this in a minute, this is not just in the Jewish world. You see that even political discourse today, nobody listens to anybody else. Nobody wants to learn from another person. Everybody knows everything, and it's the only way that it can possibly be. Nobody's open anymore to the idea that maybe somebody else has a point, maybe there's some, you see this Seder. And when the Rebbe wrote this, again, 100 years ago, it probably was not as bad as it is today. It hasn't gotten better over the last 100 years. If anything, it's gotten much, much worse. So, and he's going to say it's not unique to Jewish children. It's unique to it's everybody. This is the way that the world has changed, and the Jewish child has gone along with it. Since they were made into something on their own, and he has this antagonism and even a hatred that springs up inside of him against his father, his rebbeim, his teachers. So he doesn't only contend with them, he doesn't only conflict with them. He also hates everything that they teach him and their entire way. He wants to be nothing like them. He sees them as old school. They're old-fashioned. They don't get it. They're living in an old world. These types of lashonos that we hear all the time, right? They want nothing to do with it. So even if they see something that their father may not be imposing on them, but if they feel that this is my father's way, they're not interested. They want to cut that out. They want to fight it. They start to look at everything that their parents and their teachers represent with contempt and with hatred. So what's the result of what we're saying? Right, we've painted a very bleak picture. This is a problem. So what comes out? Before we just translate that, what the Rebbe is saying is, okay, this is the reality. We can't change the reality. If one wants to sit around and cry and remember what it was in the good old days, so you're doomed to failure. Because those kids you're right, there were a lot of things that worked 100 years ago that don't work today. That's the reality. Our job is to deal with that reality. Our job towards ourselves, to know that we have this inside of us, and towards our children, towards students, towards anybody we come into contact with. We're dealing with a different generation. So what many people like to do, many rebbeim, you'll hear parents will say, when I was a kid, if I would have talked to my father that way, and it's true to some degree, every generation gets a little bit more chutzpahdik. So what we allow our kids to get away with, we could never have gotten away with towards our parents. So if you want to sit around and say, the kids today, they're not like we were, you're right. But what is that going to accomplish? The bottom line is they're not like we were. So we have to deal with the kids that we have. And more than that, and I think he makes this point a little bit later on, Hashem put us in the position to be mechanech these children. That means we're the ones who are best able to deal with it. Our grandparents may not have been able to deal with these kids, although that he doesn't say. That he says the opposite. He says they would have been able to. But our challenge is to deal with this. We are suited to deal with these challenges. So he says, in the earlier days, every leader, every father was able to mechanech the children and to teach them the way of Hashem. And even if they did not listen to Shlomo HaMelech's instructions of finding a unique path for each child, each child's way of thinking, each child's essence. And what did they do? What we said in the beginning of this introduction that he said not to do, which is just to make them get accustomed to it, just to get them regularly performing mitzvahs and to command them. In an earlier generation, it worked. Even though it wasn't the best, he's saying that still, even in those generations, it would have been better had they found the essence of the child. But it worked. For the most part, it worked. In most cases, it worked. Because a child, when he was young, and even when he got a little bit older, nefesh nekiah, he was a clean slate. He didn't have all kinds of sense of self and all kinds of opinions and ideas of his own. Not only was he a blank slate, he knew he was a blank slate. He didn't think that he knew better. He may not have been happy with what his father wanted him to do. He may have had a taiva to do something that he wasn't supposed to do. But he never thought he knew better than his father. He didn't have that idea that I know better. And therefore, he had a certain thirst, an inner thirst inside of him. Therefore, he wanted to learn from everybody because he knew that he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to go about living a life, and therefore he was open to whatever anybody was willing to teach him. And even there were kids who were wild kids at that time, and there were times where they would refuse to listen. They realized afterwards that they had done something wrong. They didn't sit there giving a whole drasha why it was right to skip Shiur and go hang out someplace else. They understood that what they did was wrong. When after they were done, they got it out of their system. They knew what they had done was wrong. Today, everybody can give you a drasha why not only did he do what he did wasn't wrong, why it was better than if he would have been in yeshiva. It was a mitzvah for him to go because I need some time off, and if I don't go skiing for 4 days, then I can't learn properly I was guilty of these. I'm sure we were all guilty of these things. But that's the current. When we say the current generation, it's already been going on since 1920s at least. So we don't even acknowledge that there was a chait. So if we don't acknowledge that there's a chait, that makes the father and the teacher's job much harder. And in those days, if a father gave musar or he even hit his child, the child still realized, he might not have been happy about it, but he realized that his father was the tzaddik and he was the one who had done something wrong. It was the recognition of it, that this is the way it is. My father knows better than I do. Ruchay nafal b'kirvay ma'at. He would become a little bit dejected. V'kafes atzma l'shmaya ma'at l'koylim, and he would resolve. He would force himself to from now on I'm going to listen. U'levatlas ritzayim b'nei ritzayim, and I'm going to subdue my own will in favor of my father and my teacher's wills. U'ma'at ma'at kalat b'kirvay as Torah Hashem, and slowly but surely he would absorb Hashem's Torah. Liyas Yehudi Neman, to be a Jew with emunah. Im haya echem mehem Yosef ben Torah pachas. Rabbi's saying not all of them became Bnei Torah. They didn't all become Talmidei Chacham. They didn't all become tzaddikim. But they had good, simple emunah. They didn't. For the most part, most Jews were good from Jews. I mean, if we think historically, till maybe 150 years ago, most Jews were from Jews until the Enlightenment started. Most Jews were Shomrei Torah mitzvahs, or they completely shmatted. The few that you hear about completely shmatted. But for the most part, Jews lived like Jews. That was the way. They were, for the most part, they were all Ovdei Hashem. It's no longer the case. That the ego, the sense of self of the child and his internal essence, miskadem lizgabel, they prematurely develop along with it his feelings, she'ifoisav, his yearnings, hashkafoisav, his ideas, his hashkafas, while they're still bitter, unripe, they become revealed, and the result is you have a hatred between the children and the parents. There were plenty of children who were prepared to be good Jews. They're not here. They're gone. We lost them. Not only did we lose them, they turned into our enemies. They laugh at us. They make fun of us. They make fun of the fact that we have emunah. We believe in ancient gods. It's outdated. It's old. It's old school. It's not for us. This is what Shlomo HaMelech saw so many years ago. Originally, he warned us. You have to tap into this to the child you have in front of you. Not just by commanding rak b'chinuch. It has to be with chinuch v'chinuch al pi darka shekol echad ve'echad, each one in his own unique way. Ki la'el dibarnu. Earlier we explained shekol nefesh yel Yisrael. Every soul, every Jewish child's soul, oitzer shel kedusha, is a storehouse of kedusha. Every child has its own unique reservoir of kedusha. But each one needs to be released in a different way, and we have to figure out how to work with it. And in this inyan, hein emesh yishusa shel yelad hayisraeli nizdabek beruach hamahalach ben kol nar olam. True that they got caught up in this that he is describing, this new way of thinking. It's the whole world. It's not Jewish children. And true that the Jewish children have gotten swept up in this. They've gotten caught up in this. Lizgalis by the boiser, to prematurely reveal and develop. Aval eze ishis nizgabel v'yatzel chutz hala ishis Yisraelis. He says, but the Rebbe says it's still a Jewish personality, despite the fact that it looks like it's imitating the Goyim. It's still a Jewish personality. And we therefore have to feel and adapt to it. We can't just write it off and say, you know what? They're not interested. They're like the Goyim. It's still a Jewish personality. So we have to grab hold of it, and to work with it, before they turn into enemies. And he says, here's where he says, that's why I wanted to just clarify what I said before. When I said that the fact that Hashem put us in this generation to raise these children means we're best able to handle it. I don't mean best, because he says right now that earlier tzaddikim would have done a fine job. But the point is that Hashem obviously feels that we're capable and we are suited for it, and we are the most suited for it if we would stay on task, because we're the ones that Hashem put here. That's the proof that we are the best ones for it, because if there were better ones, Hashem would have put other people here for it. Right? Hashem runs the world in a very specific way. But here he says, for us to think about, to motivate ourselves, in Moshe Rabbeinu, if you took Moshe Rabbeinu, Kol HaNaviim, V'chol HaTzadikim, all the Neviim and Tzadikim, Hirkinu es atzma migoydel madrugas tzidkosam eleinu, aflo tzarchi gufenu. What was Moshe Rabbeinu? We have in these parshas, we're dealing with these parshas now. Moshe Rabbeinu was busy all day with, we need water, we need bread. Moshe Rabbeinu was a man who was almost not a man. He was up in Shemayim, learning with Malachim, understanding Sisrei Torah that nobody else after him would understand. Like, why couldn't he say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, why don't you find some administrator? Let him be busy with the water and the food. I'm the Rosh Hashiva. I'm busy here with I have to prepare Shiur. Why am I so busy with? And yet every time the Jewish people complained about even the most mundane things, Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who personally dealt with it. He didn't send Yeshua to go deal with it. He didn't send anybody else. He dealt with it. He lost going into Eretz Yisrael, however you want to explain that Maisa, but because he was dealing with water. He couldn't find anybody else amongst the 600,000 Jews who might have been a good administrator. But the point is, Moshe Rabbeinu understood that if you want to be able to teach Jews, you have to understand what's going on in their minds. You have to, if they're distracted because they don't have water, then you need to deal with the water. Otherwise, you can't teach them Torah. So, if Moshe Rabbeinu, from his great madrega, was able to lower himself to deal with things like water and bread and meat, aren't we being over averas if we hold ourselves too important to do it? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't feel like he was too important to be dealing with regular mundane things, but we're too important to lower ourselves to the level of Jews who need our help. It's a pretty big indictment if that's how we really feel. While they're still willing to receive, while they're still there. We're dealing with people, and it's not just children; it's people we interact with all the time. We're dealing with people that maybe our interaction could lead them to either become Oivdei Neman, to be Jews with Emunah, or they can go off the derech. And we have that opportunity. And the fact that we're too busy or we have better things to do, obviously is not the case, because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't feel that way, and he did have better things to do. He had a lot better things than we have to do. So tzrichim anu laharkenes atzmenu, therefore we have to come down to them. We have to bring ourselves down to a level. Speak in their language. You can't also say, okay, this kid is going through something, but I'm going to give him a good lecture on Emunah. We have to listen to him and speak back to him in his language. Kimat le'esapech oz li'eled. Almost like to become a child, like we have to talk to them things they know. That's why Rebbeim today, which if you spoke to Rebbeim a few generations ago, would never have ever talked to the kids about baseball or football or these things. But today Rebbeim, if they can't speak that language, the kids won't relate to them. They're not just not going to, they don't feel, then they look at him as, he's not one of us. But so a Rebbe has to sort of almost humiliate himself, not entirely, and he can't give up. No, right. He can't. There's still an element of kavod Torah, and there's still an element also you can't give up on his own Yiddishkeit. He can't put himself into things just because the kids are engaged in things. But within a certain mahalach, he has to talk in a way that the kids are going to relate to him. And he has to speak to them in a way that matches where their minds are at and where they feel what they consider to be valuable. The interesting thing about Moshe Rabbeinu, it says when we did the Chet HaEgel, when they did the Chet HaEgel, we did the Chet HaEgel, what does Hashem say to Moshe? His first words are Lech Reid. You have to go down to them. You can't send anybody, and you can't stay up here and try to just fix it from up here. You need to go down. There's obviously something wrong there. You need to go down to their level, and you need to fix it. You need to deal with them on a personal level where they're holding, and you need to help them fix it. They're in pain. They did something so terrible. They're in pain. You need to relate to them. The first thing you have to do is go down to them, lech raid to their level, and then we could talk. Then you can come back up and ask me to forgive them. But the first thing you have to do is you have to go down to their level, and that's what the Rebbe is saying here. So we're starting to see. We just touched on it now, but we're starting to see where he's going with this. What his concept is. In other words, now that we've established what the kids are like today, and now that we've established that you need to that Chanech Lana Al Pi Darkei means you need to talk on their level. Now he's going to start to explain, how do we do that? How do we, a kid who has this sense of self and this arrogance that he knows better, how do we deal with that? How do we interact with that person, and how do we deal with that in trying to free that child up from his, getting in his own way? How do we free him of those shackles without him feeling like we're trying to impose our will on him? And that's what he's going to start to develop next time, is how we do that in a way that we still allow the child to hold on to his sense of self, and yet be open to listening to his parents and to his rebbeim.